You know, you look at a political map of the world,
Yeah.
right? And you generally expect a country to be just a single contiguous shape.
Right, like a solid block of land with defined borders,
Yeah.
colored in some uniform pastel shade.
Exactly. You just point to it and say, there it is. But then you zoom in on Southeast Asia and you hit Malaysia.
Yeah, and suddenly that solid block is just completely fractured.
It really is. It's split right down the middle by like 600 miles of the South China Sea.
Right.
On the left, you have this peninsula hanging off the Asian mainland. And then on the right, you have this northern sliver of the massive ancient island of Borneo. It's a geographical masterpiece of extreme dualities.
It really is. I mean, it forces you to immediately question how a nation even functions,
Oh.
you know? Like, when its physical reality is literally divided by an ocean,
Yeah.
you're looking at a puzzle where the pieces are physically separated. Yet somehow, through all this historical gravity and complex social engineering, they hold together to create a stunningly cohesive state.
And that is exactly why we are plunging into this custom-tailored deep dive today. We have a towering stack of source material. I mean, historical records, demographic data, environmental studies, economic analyses.
That's a lot to get through.
It is. So we need a way to organize it all. So I want you listening to construct a theater of the mind here.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Imagine we are opening a massive, high-definition, beautifully bound encyclopedia. We are talking about thick, glossy pages. But this isn't just a static book. I want you to visualize vibrant, moving audio infographics.
Like mental encyclopedia plates.
Exactly. Imagine color-coded demographic charts pulsing with data, rich emerald green topographical maps of ancient rainforests, and stark crimson timelines of colonial empires. We're going to build this incredible place in your mind layer by layer.
I really love that visual framing. My mental backdrop for this deep dive is already shifting. I'm picturing this tapestry transitioning from the faded parchment of ancient spice routes to ultra-modern interactive structural charts.
Yeah, the contrast is wild.
Because to understand Malaysia, you really have to hold contrasting images in your head simultaneously. You have a 130-million-year-old ecosystem standing right alongside these ultra-modern glass and steel skylines.
And you have an economy deeply embedded in global tech supply chains, but it's governed by a constitutional system featuring a rotating monarchy.
Right. It's the ultimate case study in how complex systems survive and flourish.
Whether you are trying to understand how ecosystems adapt or how global economies pivot, or just how highly diverse, multi-ethnic societies integrate Malaysia is a masterclass.
It really is.
But before we get to the high-tech exports and the rotating kings, we have to start at the foundation. So let's project our first mental infographic for you. The etymology, the literal words that define this space.
Yeah, the name Malaysia itself is a really fascinating linguistic artifact. If you break it down, it's essentially a portmanteau.
Okay.
You have the root word Malays, and you attach the Latin-Greek suffix ea, which broadly translates to land of the Malays.
Makes sense.
But tracing the root of that identity takes us back thousands of years. We aren't just looking at a modern political label, we're looking at a term that migrated across oceans and empires.
Okay, let's unpack this. The sources mention some incredibly ancient texts. We are talking about the Vayu Purana, which is a Sanskrit text from the first millennium CE, and it references a land called Malayadvipa.
Right, and scholars link that to the modern Malay Peninsula.
And then you have Ptolemy's Geographia from the 2nd century, referencing Malayu Kulon on the west coast of what he called the Golden Chersonese.
Yeah, but we have to be careful not to project our modern understanding of the word Malay backward in time.
What do you mean?
Well, the geographic and cultural definition was highly fluid back then. Historians believe the term Malayu actually originated as the name of a specific river.
Wait, a river?
Yeah, the Sungai Malayu in Sumatra, which is in modern-day Indonesia.
Wait, hold on. So the foundational name for the country of Malaysia started as a river in a completely different modern country.
Exactly. It was a hyper-local identifier. Over time, a kingdom grew along that river, the Malayu Kingdom, which was eventually absorbed by the massive Srivijaya Empire.
Wow.
So the term Malayu floated around as a regional identifier, but the tectonic shift in its meaning didn't actually happen until the 15th century.
Right, with the rise of the Malacca Sultanate on the Malay Peninsula.
What's fascinating here is how a word goes from describing a river in Sumatra to defining an entire ethno-religious identity on a peninsula.
Yeah, how does that mechanism work?
It's all about trade and religion. Malacca became one of the most powerful and wealthy trading ports in the world. And as it expanded, its rulers converted to Islam.
Okay.
This is the crucial pivot. The Malacca Sultanate institutionalized the culture. Being Malayu stopped being just about where you were born. It became an ethno-religious identity.
So it was like a cultural umbrella.
Exactly. To be Malay meant to speak the local Malay language, to practice the local customs, and crucially, to be Muslim and loyal to the Meccan Sultan. It unified all these diverse Muslim traders and locals operating within that maritime empire.
So the identity is solidified locally, but then we have to look at the suffix, right? Because that doesn't come from a local sultanate. That comes from a French navigator.
Yes. Jules de Monterville.
Right.
In 1831, he returns from this massive expedition to Oceania and presents a paper to the Société de Géographie in Paris.
As you do.
Right. And he looks at the vast expanse of the Pacific and Southeast Asia and just decides it needs neat European categorization.
Naturally.
So he proposes dividing the region into Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and Malaysia, which he used to describe the area commonly known at the time as the East Indies.
It is wild to me that the naming convention is essentially 19th century geographical corporate branding.
That's a great way to put it.
You have this deep indigenous cultural identity forged by monsoons and trade routes and sultanates, and then a French navigator, and later an English ethnologist named George Samuel Windsor Earle, who suggested Melanesia. They just swoop in with Greek and Latin suffixes to categorize it for Western maps.
It really highlights a pervasive theme in Southeast Asian history.
Mm-hmm.
There's this constant friction and synthesis between indigenous realities and external categorization.
Right.
And the irony is that when the peninsula actually gained independence from the British in 1957, they didn't even use the name Malaysia.
They called themselves the Federation of Malaya.
Right, exactly. They even considered resurrecting the name of an ancient kingdom, Langkasuka, but passed on it.
So it wasn't until 1963 when the peninsula merged with Singapore, Sabah, and Sarawak that the Sisi and the Aya were officially tacked on to make Malaysia.
Yeah, and some theories even suggest the sea was a nod to Singapore's inclusion.
Which is funny considering what happened later. But the name itself is basically a geological core sample of the region's history. A Sumatran river, an Islamic sultanate, and a French mapmaker suffix.
Which perfectly transitions us into the historical timeline. If we construct a mental timeline for you, picture a sprawling, intensely colorful chart, we have to start much further back than the 15th century.
Oh, way further back.
Because this landmass has been a crossroads for human migration for an unimaginably long time.
Yeah, the sources cite evidence of modern human habitation dating back 40,000 years. The Negrito populations are thought to be the first inhabitants of the Malay Peninsula.
Right.
But the geopolitical gravity of the region really starts to pull focus between 2000 BC and 1000 AD. That's when it becomes a vital node in the Maritime Jade Road.
And this is where we need to explain the mechanics of the geography. Why here? Why did this specific peninsula become one of the most contested pieces of real estate on Earth?
It all comes down to the Strait of Malacca and the monsoon winds.
Precisely. In the era of sail, you couldn't just steer a ship wherever you wanted. You relied entirely on the monsoons.
So the weather patterns dictated the global economy.
They really did. Ships from China and the East would sail south on one seasonal wind, and ships from India and the Middle East would sail east on a different seasonal wind.
Okay, so where do they meet?
The Malay Peninsula. Specifically, the Strait of Malacca. It was the waiting room. It was the natural bottleneck where these two massive spheres of global trade had to stop, drop anchor, and just wait for the winds to shift so they could sail home.
So if you control the waiting room, you control the trade. And because people are waiting for months at a time, they don't just sit on their boats.
No, they build settlements. By the 1st century AD, traders from India and China are establishing coastal towns. And with them, they bring entirely new operating systems for society.
Right. Hinduism and Buddhism arrive long before Islam.
Exactly. You see massive empires rise and fall based on this trade wealth. The Hindu-Buddhist Srivijaya Empire dominated from the 7th to the 13th century. Later, the Majapahit Empire exerted influence.
But the anchor point for the modern Malaysian state's historical narrative is the early 15th century, right? The Malacca Sultanate.
Yes. Founded by Paramaswara, who was a prince fleeing from the old Srivijayan court. He sets up shop in Malacca, and under his lineage, the port becomes an absolute juggernaut.
It wasn't just a rest stop anymore. It was a highly organized, cosmopolitan emporium.
But extreme wealth attracts extreme violence.
Yeah, let's look at that timeline graphic again. The color scheme changes drastically in 1511. The arrival of the Europeans.
The Portuguese arrive first. They realize that whoever controls Malacca controls the spice trade into Europe. So in 1511, a heavily armed Portuguese fleet under Afonso de Albuquerque attacks and conquers the city.
Just took it by force.
Yeah, the Sultan flees, and the Portuguese build this massive stone fortress called the Formosa.
But the Portuguese don't hold the monopoly forever. The timeline shifts to Dutch Orange in 1641 when the Dutch East India Company, who were allied with the local Sultanate of Johor, drives the Portuguese out.
Right.
And then finally, the British blue washes over the map starting in 1786 when the British East India Company leases the island of Penang.
Notice the mechanism of colonialism changing here, though.
How so?
Well, the Portuguese and the Dutch were primarily interested in coastal fortresses, right? Just to monopolize the maritime spice trade. They largely ignored the deep jungle interior. But the British arrived during the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
Their economic needs were fundamentally different. They didn't just want spices.
Yeah.
They needed raw industrial materials.
And the Malay Peninsula was sitting on some of the richest tin deposits on the planet.
Exactly. And this leads to one of the most fascinating and chaotic periods in the sources. The 19th century tin rush.
If we pull up a mental map of the states of Perak and Selangor during this time, it is a total mess of competing factions. You don't just have British colonialists and local Malay royals.
No, you have an influx of tens of thousands of Chinese migrant workers brought in to mine the tin.
The technological shift is important here, too. The Chinese miners brought new, highly efficient water pump technology. It allowed them to mine deeper and extract vastly more tin than previous methods.
And the local Malay chiefs became incredibly wealthy leasing this land. But the mining camps were harsh, violent frontier towns organized and controlled by Chinese secret societies.
The sources specifically highlight the Larut Wars in Perak and the Klang War in Selangor. You have these two massive rival Chinese secret societies, the Gihin and the Hai San.
Right.
They are essentially operating as heavily armed corporate syndicates, fighting brutal turf wars over control of the tin mines and the water supplies needed to run them.
And they align themselves with competing Malay royals who are fighting over succession rights to the local thrones. It becomes a full-blown proxy war.
And it paralyzed the economy, right?
Completely. The tin stopped flowing down the rivers to the British ports in Penang and Malacca. And this is the catalyst for the turning point in British involvement, the Pancor Treaty of 1874.
Okay, there's a quote in the source material from Frank Swettenham, a British colonial administrator. Writing about this intervention, he claimed, "Though the circumstances demanded intervention, we came into the Malay states at the invitation of the rulers to teach them a better form of government."
Oh, wow.
Right. When I read that, it sounded exactly like a mob protection racket framing itself as a helpful business consultancy. Like, nice tin mines you have here. Shame if these secret society wars kept disrupting production. Let us just step in and advise you on how to run your country.
Well, I wouldn't call it a mob racket because that implies a purely illegal extortion scheme. This was something much more sophisticated and systemic.
Fair enough.
It was a hostile corporate takeover disguised as administrative diplomacy. The British didn't want the expense of a full military conquest, so they engineered the resident system.
How did that work?
Under the Pancor Treaty, the British would recognize a specific Malay ruler, and in exchange, that ruler was forced to accept a British resident, an advisor.
And the catch was that the Sultan had to ask and act upon the residents' advice on all matters except those touching on Malay religion and custom.
Exactly. It stripped the traditional rulers of their economic and administrative power. It transferred tax collection and resource management entirely to the British while leaving the ceremonial and religious authority intact.
Wow.
It was a remarkably efficient mechanism for imperial extraction. They mapped the borders, they built the railways to extract the tin, and later the rubber.
But drawing a border isn't the same as forging a nation. Let's flip our mental timeline to the 20th century. Because the modern nation of Malaysia was forged in an absolute crucible of war and ideology.
The paradigm absolutely shattered in December 1941. The Japanese Imperial Army invaded Malaya.
Right.
For decades, the British had projected an aura of absolute, untouchable racial and military superiority. The Japanese dismantled that myth in a matter of weeks.
They used bicycles, didn't they?
Yes. They used bicycles to rapidly move troops through the jungle paths that the British thought were impassable. They outflanked the colonial defenses and captured Singapore by February 1942.
The psychological impact of that must have been staggering. The invulnerable empire just collapses overnight.
It profoundly changed the political consciousness of the local population. The Japanese occupation was brutal, lasting over 3 years. and it really exacerbated ethnic tensions.
How so?
The Japanese treated the local Chinese population, who they viewed as sympathetic to mainland China's resistance, with horrific violence. Meanwhile, they occasionally elevated some local Malays into administrative roles.
That's a recipe for disaster.
It was, but universally it catalyzed a fierce nationalism. The people realized that the British could not protect them, and that European rule was not a permanent law of nature.
So when the British return after World War II, the genie is out of the bottle. The local populations are not going to just quietly go back to the 1930s status quo.
No, not at all.
The British try to consolidate power by proposing the Malayan Union in 1946. They want to unite all the states under a single crown colony, strip the Malay sultans of their remaining sovereignty, and grant widespread citizenship to the ethnic Chinese and Indian populations who had migrated there.
And that proposal triggered a massive, unified political awakening among the ethnic Malays. They saw the Malayan Union as an existential threat to their indigeneity and political primacy.
So what do?
They formed the United Malays National Organization, or UMNO, and organized massive peaceful protests. The pushback was so unified and intense that the British were forced to scrap the Malayan Union entirely.
Wow.
Yeah, in 1948, they replaced it with the Federation of Malaya, which restored the symbolic power of the sultans and tightened citizenship rules.
But the unrest didn't end there. In our visual timeline, the late 1940s and 1950s are colored in the stark red of Cold War conflict. We enter the Malayan emergency.
The emergency, lasting from 1948 to 1960, was a grueling guerrilla war. The Malayan Communist Party, whose fighting force was predominantly comprised of ethnic Chinese who had fought against the Japanese during WWII, launched an armed insurgency.
Right, to overthrow the British administration and establish a communist state. But how does an empire fight a guerrilla war in one of the densest jungles on the planet?
By fundamentally restructuring the human geography. The British military realized they couldn't just hunt the guerrillas in the deep jungle. They had to cut off their logistics.
Mentor the Briggs Plan.
Exactly. They forcibly relocated over 500,000 rural dwellers, mostly ethnic Chinese squatters who lived on the jungle fringes, into heavily guarded settlements called new villages.
So they essentially drained the sea to catch the fish. By moving the rural population behind barbed wire, the communist fighters in the jungle starved. They couldn't get food, medicine, or intelligence.
Precisely. It was a brutal but militarily effective strategy that eventually broke the back of the insurgency. But importantly, this conflict accelerated the path to independence.
Right, because the British realized they could only defeat the communists by winning the hearts and minds of the local population.
And that meant conceding political control. On August 31st, 1957, the Federation of Malaya became an independent sovereign nation.
But the map wasn't finished. We have independent Malaya on the peninsula. But what about the British territories across the South China Sea, on the island of Borneo? And what about the island of Singapore, sitting right at the tip of the peninsula?
This leads to the grand geopolitical architecture of 1963. There was a strategic and economic desire to merge these remaining British territories into a single superpower of Southeast Asia.
So on September 16, 1963, the Federation of Malaya merged with the Crown Colonies of North Borneo, which was renamed Sabah Sarawak, and Singapore to form the new nation of Malaysia.
But this mega merger was incredibly volatile. Just 2 years later, in August 1965, Singapore is officially expelled from the Federation.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It becomes its own independent country. I always look at this like a highly combustible school group project. You force all these distinct personalities together, and 2 years after the presentation, the group completely fractures. Why did Singapore leave?
Well, it wasn't just personality clashes. It was a fundamental structural incompatibility regarding race and economics. Singapore's leadership, primarily Lee Kuan Yew, advocated for a Malaysian Malaysia.
Meaning?
A strictly meritocratic system where no single ethnic group had constitutional primacy. However, the federal government in Kuala Lumpur, led by UMNO, was legally and politically bound to protect the special position of the Malays.
Right.
They feared that the economically dominant ethnic Chinese population would completely marginalize the indigenous populations if pure, unchecked meritocracy were implemented. The ideological friction was tearing the new federation apart. Expulsion was seen as the only way to prevent a catastrophic civil war.
And even with Singapore gone, that internal tension regarding economic disparity and ethnic identity continued to build within Malaysia, ultimately combusting in the May 13, 1969 race riots.
The 1969 riots are the darkest, most pivotal moment in modern Malaysian history. Following a highly contested election, profound economic resentment boiled over.
Fueled by the fact that the indigenous majority remained largely in rural poverty, while the ethnic Chinese minority dominated urban commerce.
Exactly. It led to severe intercommunal violence in Kuala Lumpur. Hundreds of people were killed. A state of emergency was declared, and Parliament was actually suspended for 2 years.
It is the moment the machine broke down and had to be completely re-engineered, and we are going to explore exactly how they rebuilt that social contract. But to truly understand the tension between these different states and populations, we have to visualize the physical theater they are operating on. Let's mentally swipe to the geography and biodiversity section of our encyclopedia.
Oh, definitely. We need to pull up a sweeping dual-page topographical map, because the political separation we just discussed is a direct mirror of the physical separation.
I want you to picture this. On the left page, peninsular Malaysia attached to the Indo-Chinese mainland. It is rugged, mountainous down the center, flanked by coastal plains.
And then on the right page, across 600 miles of the South China Sea, you have East Malaysia, comprising the states of Sabah and Sarawak on the northern tier of the island of Borneo.
It is the only country in the world with territory on both the Asian mainland and the Malay archipelago.
And the scale of the geography in East Malaysia is staggering. In Sabah, you have Mount Kinabalu. It is a massive granite intrusion, thrusting upward 4,095 meters into the sky, making it the highest peak between the Himalayas and New Guinea.
Wow.
And in Sarawak, hidden beneath the jungle canopy, you have the Mulu Caves. This is a karst limestone system so vast it contains the largest known cave chamber in the world, the Sarawak Chamber. You could literally fly several Boeing 747s right through it.
That's insane. But it's what covers this landscape that is truly mind-bending. I want you to visualize a deep, almost neon emerald green blanketing the map. These aren't just woods. These are some of the oldest rainforests on the planet, estimated to be 130 million years old.
To put that timeline into perspective, these forests survived the Pleistocene ice ages.
Wait, really?
Yeah. While much of the global ecosystem was freezing and dying off, the climate here remained stable enough to serve as a biological refuge. Millions of years of uninterrupted evolution have resulted in a phenomenon known as megadiversity.
The numbers in the source material are staggering. Let's project an audio infographic of life. Imagine this glowing chart. Malaysia contains an estimated 20% of all the animal species on Earth.
That's incredible.
On the peninsula alone, there are over 620 bird species and 210 mammal species, and the flora, 14,500 species of flowering plants.
Including, famously, the Rafflesia.
Ah, the Rafflesia. I want you to clear your mind of whatever you think a flower is. Do not picture a delicate rose or a bright sunflower. Picture a botanical Godzilla. Picture a biological vampire.
It really is.
The Rafflesia has no leaves, no stems, and no true roots. It is a parasite. It infects a specific jungle vine, living entirely inside it as threads of tissue. When it is ready to reproduce, it erupts from the vine, swelling into this massive, fleshy, deep red structure that can grow over 3 feet in diameter. It is the largest single flower in the world.
And its mechanism for pollination is just as bizarre. It doesn't use sweet nectar to attract bees. It emits a thermal signature and the overpowering stench of rotting meat.
Disgusting.
Yeah, to manipulate carrion flies into pollinating it. It is an absolute masterpiece of evolutionary specialization.
It's incredible. But the next page in our visual encyclopedia is a harsh reality check. We have this ancient, vibrating green ecosystem on one side, and on the other, a stark, jagged chart showing deforestation. Because this biological treasure house is colliding head-on with modern industrial agriculture.
The conservation crisis is acute and complex. The sources indicate that over 80% of Sarawak's rainforest has been logged to some degree.
80%.
Yeah. And on the peninsula, over 60% of the original forests have been cleared. This habitat destruction has catastrophic cascading effects.
Like the Malayan tiger.
Exactly. A national symbol deeply endangered. The leatherback turtle populations that once nested on the eastern shores have plummeted by 98% since the 1950s due to habitat loss, hunting, and illegal fishing.
A 98% collapse. That is functionally extinction. And the primary engine driving this land clearance is the palm oil industry, alongside timber. Malaysia is one of the top 2 producers of palm oil in the world. So how does the state justify this? How do you balance 130-million-year-old ecosystems with global economic demands?
You have to look at the economic mechanics. Palm oil is the most efficient oil-producing crop in the world. It yields far more oil per hectare than soybean or sunflower oil. For a developing nation, cultivating palm oil was an incredibly effective mechanism for eradicating rural poverty. It brought millions of people into the modern economy. The government argues that it is trying to balance this growth by establishing 28 national parks and pledging to maintain at least 50% of the country's landmass under forest cover.
But the tension is undeniable. The sources note that the government frequently faces accusations of favoring major agricultural conglomerates over environmental protection. The economic incentives of a crop that is found in roughly half of all packaged supermarket goods globally, from soap to peanut butter, are immense. It is a constant grinding battle between preservation and profit.
And that battle over resources leads us directly to the people who inhabit this land. Just as the physical landscape is layered and complex, the human geography is a highly structured, intricately managed system. Let's transition to the demographic section.
Yes. I want you to imagine a beautifully rendered, multi-tiered demographic bar chart glowing with distinct colors. The total population is over 34 million people. It is a highly modernized society. 70% of the population lives in urban centers. But it's the ethnic breakdown that dictates the socio-political reality of the country.
The sources show a specific, legally defined categorization. The largest group, making up 69.7% of the population, falls under the category of Bumiputra.
Let's define that term precisely.
Bumiputra translates from Sanskrit roots to sons of the soil. It is an umbrella term for the indigenous populations. It includes the ethnic Malays, who form the vast majority, but it also critically encompasses the non-Malay indigenous groups, primarily located in Sabah and Sarawak, such as the Dayaks, the Kadazan Dusun, and the Melanau, as well as the Orang Asli, the Aboriginal peoples of the peninsula.
And the rest of the chart.
The second largest group is the Malaysian Chinese, comprising 22.8% of the population, followed by Malaysian Indians at 6.8%, with a small percentage of other groups and non-citizens.
Now, here is where our encyclopedia gets uniquely complicated. We have to look at the constitutional definition of a Malay. In most Western frameworks, ethnicity is viewed as a matter of ancestry or genetics, separate from religion, which is a personal belief system.
Right.
But in Malaysia, the two are legally welded together. Article 160 of the Constitution defines a Malay as someone who speaks the Malay language, conforms to Malay custom, and, crucially, professes the religion of Islam.
This raises an important question, Redding. It is a fascinating legal construct. Your ethnic identity in the eyes of the state is inherently tied to a specific faith. If a Malay person were to legally renounce Islam, which is incredibly difficult to do under the legal system, they would technically lose their constitutional status as a Malay and the privileges that come with it.
Which brings us back to the aftermath of those 1969 race riots. We talked about how the state had to rewrite the social contract. They did this through sweeping affirmative action policies, starting with the New Economic Policy, or NEP. Let's explain the mechanics of how this actually works.
The government's diagnosis of the 1969 violence was that it was rooted in a volatile economic disparity. The indigenous majority held political power but was largely impoverished, while the Chinese minority controlled the vast majority of the corporate and retail wealth.
So they stepped in.
Yes.
Yeah.
The NEP was engineered to forcefully restructure society and eliminate the identification of race with economic function.
So how does the state intervene?
Through systemic legal preferential treatment for the Bumiputra. This manifests in quotas. For decades, there have been mandatory quotas requiring publicly listed companies to have at least 30% Bumiputra corporate equity ownership.
Wow.
There are quotas ensuring higher rates of university admissions for Bumiputra students. There are government-backed scholarships, exclusive mutual funds, and even mandated discounts for Bumiputra when purchasing real estate, regardless of their income level.
So the state essentially put its thumb on the scale of the free market to artificially lift the economic baseline of the majority population. But what are the long-term ripple effects of this? The sources indicate that while it successfully created a Malay middle class, it has generated immense structural friction.
The unintended consequences are profound. According to the text, while it undeniably reduced poverty among the Malays, it also fostered deep resentment among the non-Bumiputra populations, the Chinese and Indian communities, who feel they are treated as second-class citizens in their own country, facing systemic barriers in education and business.
Right.
From an economic standpoint, economists frequently point to the brain drain effect. Hundreds of thousands of highly skilled non-Bumiputra Malaysians have emigrated to places like Singapore, Australia, or the UK, seeking systems based purely on meritocracy. It is an ongoing debate about whether a policy designed to heal a nation in 1970 is now hindering its global competitiveness in the 21st century.
And this intense categorization doesn't stop at economics. It extends directly into the justice system. Let's pull up a flowchart of the legal architecture for you. We have a dual legal system operating simultaneously.
Because Islam is the official religion of the Federation, the legal system is bifurcated based on religion. On one side, you have the civil courts. These are based on the English common law system inherited from the British. They handle all commercial, constitutional, and general criminal matters for all citizens.
And on the other side,
You have the Sharia courts, or Islamic courts. Their jurisdiction is strictly limited to Muslims. They handle family and religious matters, such as marriage, divorce, inheritance, child custody, and certain Islamic moral offenses, like drinking alcohol or skipping Friday prayers.
okay, so they operate completely separately.
Exactly. The civil courts have no jurisdiction over matters that fall under the Sharia courts.
So you have two distinct legal realities operating in the same physical space, depending on the religious identity on your ID card. It is an incredibly rigid, categorized way to organize a society. But here is the beautiful contradiction of this deep dive. If you close the legal charts and turn to the cultural section of our encyclopedia, if you look at how people actually interact on the street, those strict, rigid boundaries aggressively, wonderfully blur together.
The social reality is vastly more fluid than the legal framework suggests. Let's look at language. The sources note there are 137 living languages spoken across the country.
That's amazing.
Malaysian Malay is the official language, and English is a ubiquitous second language, especially in commerce. But the true linguistic marvel of the country is Manglish.
Manglish is incredible. I want you to conceptualize Manglish not as broken English, but as an advanced open-source coding language for human communication. You have all these different cultural programmers, Malay, Chinese, Tamil, British, and they all contributing their most efficient syntax to the same code base.
I love that analogy. It is a colloquial linguistic synthesizer. A Malaysian-speaking Manglish will take an English sentence structure, insert Malay vocabulary, add Chinese grammar rules, and punctuate it with Tamil expressions.
The ultimate example is the suffix law. It is a particle added to the end of a sentence. It doesn't have a direct English translation, but it completely changes the emotional code of the sentence.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, okay is just a statement of agreement. Okay law means, yes, I agree, let's stop arguing about it, it's fine. It is a highly efficient way to convey nuance across different cultural backgrounds. Everyone instantly understands the code.
And this blending of codes extends deeply into the social calendar. Consider the open house tradition. Malaysia has a massive array of public holidays to accommodate its diversity. You've got Eid al-Fitr for Muslims, Chinese New Year, Deepavali for Hindus, Christmas, the Gawai Harvest Festival in Sarawak.
It's just a constant rotation of holidays.
Yeah, and during these festivals, it is customary for Malaysians to open their homes and invite friends, neighbors, and colleagues of all different races and religions to come over, celebrate, and most importantly, eat.
Which brings us to the ultimate full-color centerpiece of our encyclopedia, the Malaysian dining table. If you want a visual map of how this country synthesizes its history, look at the food. Picture a table covered in a vibrant mosaic of dishes. Rich coconut whites, deep soy sauce browns, bright turmeric yellows, and the fierce, fiery red of chili sambal.
The cuisine is the ultimate physical manifestation of the spice road history we discussed earlier. You have indigenous Malay techniques colliding with centuries of Chinese wok frying, Indian spice blending, and Thai aromatics.
Let's break down the mechanics of the national dish, nasi lemak. It is a masterpiece of texture and flavor engineering. At its core, it is rice cooked in rich coconut milk and pandan leaf. But the rice is just the canvas. It is served with sambal, a deeply complex, spicy chili paste. Then you add contrasting textures, crispy fried anchovies, crunchy toasted peanuts, and cooling slices of fresh cucumber.
It's so perfectly balanced.
Historically, this was a high-energy carbohydrate delivery system for farmers heading into the fields, wrapped tightly in a banana leaf. Today, it is a culinary icon eaten by everyone.
Or consider the national drink, teh tarik, which translates to pulled tea. It is a strong black tea mixed with condensed milk. But the magic is in the preparation. The brewer pours the scalding hot tea back and forth between two metal pitchers from a height of several feet.
That visual is just so cool.
It is. This aeration process cools the tea to the perfect drinking temperature while simultaneously creating a thick, creamy layer of froth on top. It is a technique brought over by Indian Muslim immigrants that has become a national art form.
But the true genius is how the distinct culinary traditions cross-pollinate. The cultures don't stay in their lanes. For example, you can go to a Chinese restaurant in Kuala Lumpur and order kangkong belacan. Kangkong is water spinach, and it is stir-fried using a classic Chinese high-heat wok technique. But the flavor engine of the dish is sambal belacan, a pungent, intensely flavorful shrimp paste that is fundamentally Malay.
Right.
The Chinese chef is utilizing a Malay flavor profile to execute a Chinese dish. It is a perfect metaphor for the country. The people figure out how to mix it all together to create something better than the sum of its parts.
They absolutely do. The cultural integration is remarkable. But to govern, fund, and manage this incredibly vibrant, diverse, and occasionally chaotic society, the state relies on a political and economic engine that is highly specialized. Let's turn to the final major section of our mental encyclopedia, the state.
And we have to start with the monarchy because the mechanism here is astonishing. I read this and I had to double-check the sources. Malaysia has a king, the Yang di Pertuan Agong. But he's not born into a lifelong throne that rules the entire country. The king is elected, and he serves a strict 5-year term.
Yep.
He is chosen by and from among the 9 hereditary rulers of the traditional Malay states. The other 4 states in the federation don't have monarchies, so they have governors and don't get to be king. So you have a rotating crown. It's like a timeshare for a crown. Why build a highly unusual rotating system instead of a standard republic or a single royal family?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is one of the most elegant constitutional compromises in modern political history. To understand the why, we have to look back at the formation of the Federation. Remember, before the British arrived, the peninsula wasn't a single country. It was a collection of distinct, sovereign Malay sultanates, each with deep, centuries-old legitimacy and their own royal families.
Right. The Sultan of Perak doesn't want to bow to the Sultan of Johor.
Exactly. When you are forming a modern federal nation out of these independent states, how do you unify them without stripping 8 kings of their royal status just to elevate one supreme monarch? That would cause an immediate civil war.
So what's the solution?
They created the Conference of Rulers.
Yeah.
It operates almost like a corporate board of directors. The 9 monarchs take turns acting as the CEO, the king of the federal nation, for 5 years. This system honors the historical sovereignty of all 9 royal houses, binds them together under a unified federal parliament, and actively prevents a monopoly of power by any single royal family.
It is brilliant. It satisfies the need for traditional indigenous symbolism while functioning within a modern constitutional democracy. And this political engine oversees an economy that has undergone a massive structural pivot. In the 19th century, the British built an extractive economy based entirely on exporting raw tin and rubber. But modern Malaysia flipped the script.
They executed a massive industrialization strategy beginning in the 1980s. They transitioned from an agricultural and resource-based economy to a newly industrialized market economy, focused heavily on manufacturing and technology. Today, Malaysia is deeply embedded in the global semiconductor and electronic supply chain. In 2020 alone, they exported $92.1 billion worth of high-tech products.
And they also innovated entirely new financial sectors. The sources highlight that Malaysia is a major global center for Islamic banking. Let's explain the mechanics of this because it operates on completely different principles than Wall Street.
Right. Western conventional banking is fundamentally based on the concept of interest making money from money.
Yeah.
Islamic banking, governed by Sharia principles, strictly forbids the charging or paying of interest. It also forbids investing in businesses considered sinful, like alcohol or gambling.
So if a bank can't charge interest on a loan, how does it function? How do you finance a business or a mortgage?
Through risk sharing and asset backing. Money itself is not considered a commodity that can generate profit. Instead, transactions must be backed by a tangible asset. If you want to buy a house, the Islamic bank doesn't just lend you the cash and charge you interest. The bank might buy the house themselves and then sell it to you at an agreed-upon markup, which you pay back in installments.
Interesting.
Or, for a business loan, the bank essentially enters into a joint venture with the entrepreneur. They share the profits of the business, but crucially, they also share the risk of loss. Malaysia pioneered the regulatory framework for this system and is now the world's largest issuer of sukuk, which are essentially Islamic bonds.
They engineered a financial hub that bridges the Middle East and the massive economies of Asia. But, as with any highly complex machine handling massive amounts of wealth, the political engine has experienced catastrophic turbulence. We have to look at the modern history chart, specifically the 1MDB scandal.
The One Malaysia Development Berhad scandal is one of the largest financial frauds in global history. 1MDB was established as a state-owned sovereign wealth fund. The stated mechanism was that the government would borrow billions of dollars and invest it in green energy, infrastructure, and strategic development projects to boost the Malaysian economy.
But the money didn't go to infrastructure.
No. According to the U.S. Department of Justice and international investigators, a complex web of corrupt officials and financiers siphoned the money out of the fund. An estimated $3.5 billion to $4.5 billion was stolen and laundered through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore bank accounts.
And where did it end up?
It was used to buy ultra-luxury real estate in New York and London, a super yacht, priceless artwork, and even to finance a major Hollywood movie. The scandal deeply implicated the sitting prime minister at the time, Najib Razak, who was heavily involved with the fund.
The scale of the embezzlement is almost impossible to comprehend, but what is truly important for our encyclopedia is the systemic reaction to this corruption. The democratic immune system kicked in.
It did. The outrage over 1MDB, combined with the rising cost of living, became the primary catalyst for the historic 2018 general election. For the very first time since the country gained independence in 1957, a period of 61 years, the ruling political coalition, Barisan Nasional, was voted out of power.
That is a seismic democratic milestone, a peaceful transition of power after 6 decades. But it also initiated an era of intense, unprecedented political fragility. The sources map out governments collapsing, prime ministers resigning midterm, all colliding with the chaos of the COVID-19 pandemic.
The old political certainties were gone. This period of instability culminated in the November 2022 general election. The electorate was highly fractured, resulting in the first hung parliament in the nation's history. No single party or coalition won the 112 seats required for a simple majority. The machine essentially stalled.
But it didn't break. The rotating monarch we discussed earlier, the king, stepped in to mediate. And ultimately, Anwar Ibrahim, a veteran politician who had spent years in the opposition and even time in prison, was appointed prime minister. He managed to forge a grand, multi-coalition unity government, partnering with his former political enemies to break the deadlock and form a working majority.
It is a testament to the fundamental resilience of the Malaysian electoral and constitutional system. They managed to navigate a massive corruption scandal, a pandemic, and an unprecedented constitutional crisis without military intervention or a collapse of the state. They found a new, albeit complex, configuration to keep the nation moving forward.
And I think that brings us to the final page of our massive mental encyclopedia. We have constructed this incredible country in our minds. We started with Sanskrit texts and Sumatran rivers. We mapped the monsoon trade winds that brought empires and religions to the Strait of Malacca.
We visualized the brutal mechanisms of British colonialism, the jungle warfare of the emergency, and the literal physical split of the nation across the ocean.
We explored the majestic, fragile biology of a 130-million-year-old rainforest, the strict legal categorization of its multi-ethnic society, the financial architecture of Islamic banking, and the democratic resilience of its modern parliament.
It is an overwhelming synthesis of data, history, and culture.
So why does all this matter to you? Why did we construct this massive encyclopedia today? Because Malaysia is not just a point on a map. It is a living, breathing laboratory for the modern world. If you want to understand the mechanics of managing extreme diversity, whether you are structuring a multinational corporation, leading a diverse community, or trying to balance economic growth with environmental survival, Malaysia provides a profound, real-world case study.
It really does. It shows how deeply distinct identities can be bound together into a cohesive whole. It shows the unintended consequences of policies designed to fix historical wounds. It shows how a complex system must constantly adapt to survive its own internal pressures.
And it demonstrates that true integration isn't a neat, frictionless process. It is highly complex, frequently contradictory, and requires constant maintenance, but it is ultimately capable of producing immense cultural, intellectual, and economic wealth.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Which leaves us with a final thought for you to carry forward. We started this deep dive by picturing a solid, uniform block on a map, and we quickly realized that Malaysia is anything but uniform. We live in a modern world that often feels like it is trending toward one of two extremes. Either total homogenization, trying to make everything and everyone exactly the same, stripping away what makes them unique, or complete polarization, where different groups retreat to their corners, refuse to interact, and keep their ingredients strictly separated in their own jars. But consider the alternative. Consider the beauty of Manglish, where different codes combine to communicate more efficiently. Consider the genius of using a neighbor's spicy shrimp paste to elevate a traditional loke stir-fry. The most resilient, the most vibrant, and the most flavorful outcomes in life don't come from enforcing uniformity or maintaining absolute separation. They come from the chaotic, imperfect, and beautiful blending of different worlds.
It's a great thought to leave on.
Take a look at your own life or your own work. What different ingredients, opposing perspectives, or disparate ideas are you currently keeping separated? What could happen if you allowed them to cross-pollinate today? Think about that, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.